Hey everyone, welcome back to Shutter Magazine. I'm Dustin Lucas, and today I'm going to be talking to you about Lightroom Classic. So we're going to be going through the top 5 steps on how to learn Lightroom Classic. So if you're new to photography or you've been doing this for years, you've likely heard of Lightroom Classic, but if you've never used the program and you want to learn how to quickly, this is the video for you. So just to keep in mind, Lightroom has a couple versions. There's a Lightroom CC version, which is the mobile version that a lot of iPad or tablet users like to utilize. You can also use it on a desktop, but I don't recommend it. Lightroom Classic, or the original version of Lightroom as we all know it, is the desktop-based version. So it's going to be built for a faster raw workflow, and you typically will have your files on an external drive and you will save your catalogs local. So this is not the cloud-based version. Now Lightroom Classic and Lightroom CC are subscription based, so as many of you users out there using different softwares, almost every software is subscription based, so just keep in mind there is a monthly charge to it. It's like $10 a month to have Lightroom Classic, Photoshop, things like that. But what's important about this program and why you should be using Lightroom Classic is it's fast. It's faster than using Bridge and Camera Raw. Some of you out there that are using that workflow that say that's the way to go, I challenge you to use Lightroom Classic. It's just beefier and a better program to organize all of your files and edit those files in one place. So we're going to be walking through the 5 steps on how to learn Lightroom, right? So first things first, Lightroom is catalog based. So that means that you have a catalog file here. Mine is called literally Lightroom catalog .lrcat. It's a catalog file saved on my computer. You have to create one, and then you'll have to import photos into Lightroom, right? So we'll go through that a little bit later. So step number 2 is going to be organizing and culling. So we're going to be doing that in library mode. We can view our images, pick the ones that we want to deliver to our client, but definitely make sure that we discard the crappy ones, right? You can also organize your files, rename them, move them into different folders. It's a way to digitally manage all of your assets. Step number 3 is going to be diving into develop. That's the editing part. So there's a basic component, which is step number 3. We'll cover color correction, presets, things like that. And then step 4, we'll jump into develop mode for more advanced look at the program to kind of understand masking and these different creative tools to add a little more flair to your images. Then step 5 is going to be exporting your images. So something to keep in mind, unlike most programs, you actually have to bring your images into this program, edit inside of this program, and then you have to export them out, right? It's the easiest kind of way to explain how Lightroom works. It's a little bit different. A lot of times you open images up into Photoshop or into other programs, and you edit on them, then you have to save as, and then you're done, right? You kind of do it, kind of make a new version of that file. And Lightroom files come in, you do all the work in it, and then you export them out. So just to give you a heads up. So let's dive into step number 1, creating a catalog and importing our images. All right, so step number 1 is going to be create a catalog, which we've already done. So the first time you open up Lightroom, a catalog is going to need to be created, and likely it's going to just automatically name it Lightroom catalog, right? So right out the gate, you have to be thinking, okay, it creates a catalog. Do I create a new catalog every time I shoot a new event? It's a valid question. Or do I work in the same catalog where all my work lives so I can have one space, right? That's a great question. And the answer is it depends, right? I recommend a master catalog workflow, which means you work in one catalog where all your work comes in. So you can see on the left-hand side, I have all these events, right? I have them broken down into different event types based on year. Keep in mind, Lightroom is a very robust program, so you don't have to worry about shooting 100,000 files over 2 or 3 years and it running slow. Lightroom runs very efficiently, but it also relies on you setting Lightroom up properly. So we'll go through that a little bit further. So let's jump into the import module, right? So we're going to work on our master catalog, and I'm going to import files into this Lightroom catalog. Now when I click on the import button in the lower left hand corner, that's one option to go into import. Another option would just be to go File, Import Photos and Videos. And so what you're going to notice is you have these 4 options at the top. Add files, and this means that they've already been copied off of your memory card, likely to some external storage. There's Move, which I don't typically use, but Copy and Add are the 2 that I would typically. So if I wanted to bring some files in from my local hard drive or an external hard drive, this is the option I would choose. Okay, so for the Add feature, I can select an external hard drive that I might already have photos onto. But if I do plug in my memory card or my camera directly, I would have to copy these files. So you'll see at the very top here, these options are going to change as soon as I choose, right, both memory cards that are in the camera. And keep in mind the difference between selecting here, where it's devices, you can only select one device at a time. But if you have multiple memory cards with different images on them that you want to select at the same time and import, it really helps to select them under the Files section instead of devices, just as a quick tip. Now, as you're going through these images, right, this is a quick import for some family photos that we took. So as I'm looking at all of these images below, you'll see that I have these destination options, right? So I wouldn't want to copy these files to my local hard drive. I'd want to put these on my main hard drive, right? So I would choose different options down here, right? So if I wanted to save my options each time, I could create a preset at the very bottom down here, right? So say for instance that I wanted to save these in, let's drop down a couple options. So Graham, and we'll put these into raw originals. And now I also want to make sure build smart previews are checked and minimal is selected. So I could take this option and either update my current preset or save a new one, right? So I can call this memory card to hard drive, right? Just kind of make something up. So now as I choose different options here, let's go to smart previews, back to memory card to hard drive, right? It's going to choose that option automatically for me. And I can sort these by date, right? So all these kind of things really help. If I want to just do smart previews, it's not really going to know where I'm grabbing files from. So if I wanted to already import files from the external hard drive, this is the biggest difference, right? So if I want to import files from raw originals, it's just going to add them, which is going to be faster, right? I've already copied them from the memory card to an external hard drive. I want to make sure that that's clear on the differences between importing from an external hard drive, you're going to add, or importing from a memory card, you're going to have to copy those files from your memory card to external storage. Now jumping into the file handling section, what's really important, I always choose build smart previews, but every workflow is different. If you want to stay connected to the raw files and you want to select directly from the raw files because you want to make sure sharpness is optimal, of course you can. I recommend importing with one-to-one previews, and I would turn off build smart previews. So when those files come in, they build 100%. So you might be wondering, what are the difference between previews? Let's jump into that next. So now that my import is done and I've built my smart previews, as you'll notice when I select all of these files, right, it's going to show that I have original plus smart previews, and then some of these I just have smart previews for, right? So keep in mind that when we are importing images and later when we rename files, it's very important that we have these original files available on the hard drive. So now that we're done with the creating a catalog and importing our files, we can build previews later, right? So you want to make sure that your standard previews, going to library, previews, build standard previews, are built automatically before you start going to the next step, which is going to be organizing and culling. All right, so now we're ready for step number 2, which is going to be organize and cull in Lightroom. So before we organize our files, rename them, move them, we definitely want to choose the images we want to keep. As you'll see, I already kind of have some 5-star selected down here and some color labels, right? I've already done that. So I want to show you a quick trick to make sure when you're culling images, Lightroom is running fast. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to double click on the first image. I'm going to hold shift and hit tab so it makes all my panels go away. And then I'm going to hit the L key twice to take us into lights out mode. Now what's important is I'm connected to the RAWs. You'll see very shortly that I'm going to get some loading screens here once I zoom in, right? So once I go to the next image and I'm running through these, eventually these images are going to be, it looks like they're running actually pretty quick. Likely my previews are already built. So let's start with assuming that I don't have any previews built. And we'll go back into my originals folder here and we will remove this. Let's go ahead, select all, previews, discard, one-to-one previews. Now, since I've already got those built before, that's why it was running fast. So I want to show you what it's going to be like when you're going through these images and you zoom in and it has to build these, right? See, as it takes a second for it to do it. It's still pretty quick, but you can see it kind of takes a second for them to load. As you see through that. So what's important is you want to make sure that we disconnect from the original files. That's really important, right? So if I want to go ahead and right click on this and choose update folder location, that's one way to disconnect. Another way would just be to disconnect from the hard drive, which I think is better to do, right? I don't want to change the path of these files and get everything disorganized. It kind of defeats the purpose. So what I would do is I'd come in here and I would eject those drives. And once I do that, you'll see this option becomes just Smart Preview. So once we wait for that drive to go away, all right, now that it's ejected, I'm going to go back here and it says Smart Preview. See how it changed? I only have Smart Previews now. So I don't have to have those RAW files online to work on my pictures, which is very important for the efficiency. So as I go through here and I go to library and I want to build standard size previews, it's going to run that instantly, right? So now that I'm ready to select my pictures, I like to use a little trick here, okay? So I use the filter that says if I apply a flag, it's going to filter that image out of my selection. So if I click this option here, then I go into lights out mode, like we had done earlier. If I apply, let's say, an X flag, which is going to reject this image, it's going to take it away from my view. So any images I want gone, I just hit the reject flag, right? So any of these that I don't like, right, I can easily hit, right? If I'm going through these images and I want to quickly just get rid of the ones that I don't want to necessarily keep or show, or ones that might be out of focus. Let's run through some out of focus images, right? So this doesn't really make any sense. I'm going to get rid of it. These I might consider later, so I'll keep them in. But I'm going through these images, right? And if I want to zoom in, this is something to keep in mind too, right? I can't zoom in as far as a one-to-one, but that to me seems good enough to see if it's in focus. So with some of these images, I can quickly go through and make sure any that are soft, right? This is completely out of focus. I don't want to show that, right? So I can zoom in here, same way there, right? Just a quick way. And now I'm only looking at the images I like, right? Just a quick way to cull your images. So when you're all done, right, get out of lights out mode, hold shift, hit tab, our panels come back. I can hit the G key, takes me right back into grid mode. And then I can, right, if I undo that, you'll see all these reject flags, right? So you can always go back to the file. It's not like you lose them. It's just applying reject flags to them. Now, when I'm all done, say with my first cull, where I just remove the bad pictures, then I go through the second layer for my favorites, or reduce duplicates, I'm going to use 5 stars, right? So if I accidentally flag something, I can use the U key and I can unflag it, right? If I accidentally applied a reject flag to it. So now that I've done that, what I can do is I can make a decision here. I can rename my files now, or I can start editing. I like to wait to rename my files till I'm done editing, I've made my final edits, and I'm ready to export. That's when I want to rename, and that's what I recommend. So let's jump into how I would start the editing process in selecting pictures. All right, so we're on to step number 3, which is going to be develop mode, the basics, right? So what we need to do is we need to choose what I call anchor images, or images that are at the beginning of each sequence, and we want to mark those in red. And I'll tell you why in just a minute, right? So as you go through and you make all of your images at the beginning of each sequence red, we just hit the 6 key to apply a red label. So once we are done, right, we have 54 images total that we need to color correct. Now, we only have 163 total, so that might be a little heavy on the anchor images, right? It's almost like editing the full job. But just keep in mind, I like to choose the image from the beginning of each sequence so we can create a reference image. So now that we're done with our labeling, I want to find an image that's an even light that has the main subject in it in both, right? So I'd probably want to choose, and I can hit my plus key to kind of make these previews bigger. But what I want to do is I want to have mom and baby in the image that I'm going to choose to edit. And let's choose maybe one with the whole family, right? So let's just choose this image. I think this image will be fine. It's, lighting is what it is. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to reset this image so that way we can kind of see it from scratch. Now, what I want to do is I want to color correct this file. Now, before I get started color correcting, I might want to apply some starting settings to all my images up front before I start color correcting. And that's where preset comes in, okay? So for us, if our preset, for instance, is, let's just bring this into import. Maybe we want to have a little bit of contrast start out, so I'll put plus 10. I'll drop the highlights a little bit, add some shadows, drop the black point, add a little texture. And this is where it takes a little bit of knowledge in Lightroom on what you want to add to a photo, because you might be editing and thinking, I only want to correct the issues that I see. But if you want to apply kind of the same style or something a little more stylistic, and that's the path I'm going to go down, I want to make sure all my images have that same style applied. So when it comes to style, I want to make sure maybe I want to add a little more sharpening. I'll worry about noise reduction after the fact. So if I want to hit the I key, I can look at ISO. That won't really matter in this moment, but I want to turn on lens correction, right? But I might not like the fact that I might like the vignette or might not, right? So we can keep the vignette, but we fix the distortion, right? All these kind of very specific things. Now, if you're going to mess with vignette and distortion, I definitely wouldn't create that into a preset. You want it to be kind of default. So I'm going to fix those things with the lens, and I'm going to leave it like that. And I'm not really going to go into any other parts of the image. Now, I don't typically use Adobe Color. We'll get into that in the more advanced end, but a profile is important as well when it comes to building a preset. So as we have this as our preset that we want to start kind of maybe on every image, as you can see, right, before and after, right, it just offers a little bit of a punch. So if you want more punch, and maybe you want to use, instead of the contrast, you want to use tone curve, might be a familiar tool. You can use medium contrast, and it just adds a little more, right, contrast to our image. Now you might be thinking, well, these shadows are a little heavy. We could hit the J key to see where the clipping is. That's pretty cool. We can see where the shadows are clipped. So we already kind of know, hey, we need to recover some of those shadows, but we want to create a good base preset. And I think this one starts well. So I'm going to hold Shift, Command, and N, and that's going to create a new develop preset. So I'm just going to call this starting point. And you might update this, change these settings later. Of course you can do that. And you only want to check the boxes that you're adjusting. So I'm going to hit check none, and I'm going to choose treatment and profile. I'm not using exposure or wipeouts. I don't use contrast, and I'm using highlights, shadows, blacks. I got some texture, texture and tone curve and lens correction. That's it. So I can apply these into my presets. right? And you can create your own group, right? You don't have to put it into user presets, which is standard. You can create a new group if you want to create and separate those. Now, once we hit create, we can go back to library. We can select all of our images, and this is important. We want to apply that preset, right, to all of them right here. I'm not going to click on this in the moment because this job is edited and done, but we would click starting point after selecting all 163 images that we selected. We want all of them to have that same starting point, right? So they're consistent. These things are really important. So now that we are ready to edit our anchor image, let's go back in and get it a little more dialed in. So this is the image that we were looking at originally. I like to edit with the before and after, so I'm going to hit the D key and then hit Y so I can see what it looked like as a raw, and then the after. So I already want to brighten this image up a little bit because I'm going to look at their faces and I'm going to make sure we are within range. And I don't need it to go into 200%. I think 100% is fine. And I'm going to add a little, let's get our windows a little bit bigger here. I want to add a little exposure, and I'm going to focus on mom here. So add a little exposure. I'm going to recover those shadows, not too much, right? We don't need her hair to turn gray, but we just want to add a little more, and I'm going to cool this image down just a little bit, right? It's a little warm for my taste. Now, I don't know, by the way, here's a little trick. I don't know if that wall is neutral, but I'm making it neutral by clicking on this white point target back here. So I don't know that, right? So I'm going to use my best judgment and just kind of cool this image down to here. So we go from there to there, right? Might be a little cool for your taste. Again, this is my color correction. This is kind of my style and what I'm going into. And I'd want to make sure, right, we are recovering the son's face in these highlights. But we want to keep in mind what it's doing to mom's face and shirt. And I think that that's okay, right? So we're here to here. Nothing too crazy, just a basic color correction, right? A little bit of sharpening, all that kind of stuff. That's really the basics, right, of doing the develop mode editing. Now, once I do that, my next step would be to take this image into reference mode. Now that I have my standard or target image, I'll hold Shift and then R. So this takes me into reference mode, and I'm going to drag that image up in the left-hand corner, right? And I want to set that as my reference photo. I'm going to lock it because this is the photo I'm going to use. I'm going to use for the remaining images when I want to edit. So here's what's cool. Normally, when you're in Lightroom, right? I'm going to get out of reference mode here real quick and just go back into this. You view every image one at a time, okay? This is the normal way, typical way that you're going to edit in Lightroom, one image at a time, right, with your develop panel. Well, what I'm going to show you here with reference mode is going to give you the ability to look at your reference image on the left, which I'm going to drag and drop it over here, Shift R, reference photo, and now, this is the cool part, we can go to each image and match it directly, right? So obviously we'd want to have our preset applied to these other images. So let's go ahead and just follow suit, right? Let's just say that all these images here already have the preset applied. Again, these ones were edited with a different preset altogether, but let's just run through this realistically here. So as we're going through this mode, I can take this image and literally match it to mom here and try to get her to match, right, across the board there. So if I want to bring up shadows, cover highlights, I can go to each image like that, right? So of course, if you're thinking, well, that's a similar setting, let's sync settings, right? I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but Shift Command S, when I have two images or multiple images in a sequence selected, check none. We only want to have the settings that we are editing with to sync. And now those images look close. Just brighten mom up a little bit, right? And I keep running through these images. It's a very fast way to edit. And the reason why we're making these anchor images are when we are done, we now have images, right? If we filter out of our 6, we have images we should be able to just sync in grid mode, right? It's not going to be perfect, but you can start syncing these images in grid mode between all the red images, right? That's what we should be doing, right? So all these images, they're going to get pretty close. So the importance of that is then we're going to go back through and develop later, and we're going to edit. And you might use that same workflow where you go, here's my red image, here's my reference image, and you can change that reference image to the red one, and then you can edit each picture to have them match it, right? How cool, right? It's a little kind of a basic to intermediate tutorial there, but that's the best way to kind of get that consistency. A little long-winded, but I wanted to show you that trick because I really think that helps with editing and really speeds things up. All right, so step number 4 is going to be using the develop mode in a more advanced way. So earlier when we were talking about building presets, working in the basic panel, there is this major setting adjustment option that you have. It is called profile, right? So as we go through these different profiles, you're going to see immediately how different our image looks just by applying this profile or overlay, right? So the image changes in contrast, color, all these kind of things, right? So you're thinking, well, I'd probably want to apply that profile first before I do my color correction. And you'd be right. So there are different profiles out there. Develop makes them. Visco used to make profiles, but they don't anymore. Not for desktop. There's all kinds of different film style, different camera style. You can even create custom profiles. The hell is a custom profile, right? Not really for a tutorial today, but you can make your own profiles as well, which is pretty cool. Now, I like to use the color fidelity profiles. I mean, I get no recognition or no kickback from them at all, but they seem pretty good for getting different camera models to be pretty consistent. And the portrait option, just in my opinion, between Adobe Color, it's just a little bit lighter, a little bit brighter. I think it looks nice, and I probably don't need to use as much, right, exposure because of that. So I like the way that profile looks. I'm going to stick with it. Now, for the advanced editing, we can do some different cool effects with color. So the first one that I really like is the color grading. So for instance, if I'm looking at this image and I want to add some cool tones to the shadows, I can. It's pretty simple, right? So in color grading, in the all options, right, the 3-way, I can drag this little circle towards the blue and it'll add some cool tones to the shadows. Okay. And I can toggle this little light switch to show before and after, right? Becomes something a little more cool. You might be thinking, man, not really for me. I just want to kind of show you what this option can do. Now, what I also like to do is add a little bit of warmth into the highlights. So it kind of adds a little bit of a color shift or kind of dual shift here, just to give you kind of, a unique effect. And you might see different effects like this with presets you buy, or maybe even images on Instagram. Not going down that path, but just kind of showing some different style and cool things. But that's kind of the gist of what color grading's for. Now, if you wanted to, right, you can hold Option and double click Reset. If you wanted to just fix, right, if we just wanted to cool down the highlights, but not cool down the shadows, we like the shadows, we just want to cool down the highlights a little bit, we can. We can actually do that by clicking and dragging in the highlights panel. Now we can go into highlights and get a little more in depth if we want to add a little bit of cool tones there. So you can actually use this to color correct. See how warm that is and how cool that gets? You might like this a little bit better so the skin's not so warm. Those highlights, those brighter tones aren't so warm, and that contrasting of all the neutrals going on in the background, right? So you can really use this as well to kind of neutralize your image and help with color. I think that's pretty cool overall with different cameras. Now, this is a little more subjective, and again, the advanced end, but just kind of want to show you different options. Now you have blending, right? So blending is going to really amplify that, right? It's going to blend that through to the other tones as well, right? It's in just the highlights, but now you're seeing it go into the shadows and the midtones, right? So blending is doing that as well. And as you drag balance to the right and balance to the left, that's going to be overall image, right? So blending will do kind of different regions, balance will do, and you know, kind of integrate those regions as well, but just kind of amplify the original image versus the effects. So those are pretty cool to use as well. Now, if you want to, and this is kind of a cool feature, if you want to use a specific color in the image and use that to kind of tint the image, right, you can drag the eyedropper here and it will kind of add that tone to the highlights based on the color, right? So if you want everything to be kind of cool like the jeans, or if the kids are wearing a specific color, or maybe it's something you're doing for branding or commercial and you want to kind of have this like shift based on the coloration, the clothing, the product, whatever the thing is, you can absolutely do that. And by picking this, so that's kind of a cool thing. Like if you wanted to kind of make the highlights, you know, if the brand, you know, called for these pants, or, you know, something else in the image, you can then come in here to the shadows and do that kind of same thing. Like if you wanted the shadows to be kind of blended in such a way, I mean, it really starts to kind of make the image, you know, look a little wild. You might be wondering, well, how does this apply for me? It might work a little bit better for commercial work, for sure. But just to kind of show you some things you can do. Now, I typically would do that push and pull with the shadows, cooling them down, warming up the highlights. But in this case, if we just wanted to quickly fix the warmness in the highlights, we can do it. We'll just go to highlights, add some cool tones, right? Simple shift. Now let's jump into target adjustment tools. So target adjustment tool, which is in the HSL panel, hue, saturation, and luminance, this will target specific colors. So for instance, if I think the pants are too much in saturation, I can choose the target adjustment tool, click on the pants and drag down, and it will desaturate the blues. Like, whoa, that's pretty cool, right? But if it's grabbing a section of the image, right? Like if you want to use skin tone, it's going to grab the reds and the orange in those skin tones. Maybe you can desaturate the skin a little bit, right? Not too much. You don't want to lose all that color. But then you can also use target adjustment tool for the hue, drag up for green, drag down for red, right? So if you want to take some of the redness out of their face, you can click on skin tones and drag upwards, right? So as we kind of zoom in here, we can see before and after. You can correct some of that redness in the skin. Maybe we went a little crazy with the orange there. Let's take it back. But you can really kind of help alleviate some of the color in the skin. But you want to be careful. It's going to everyone, right? So if dad or the kids are really pale and mom's got a little more warm tone to her face, you're really going to make those kids look more ghostly. So those are things you want to consider when using the target adjustment tool. Now, let's jump into the AI masking, right? Artificial intelligence quickly can mask these images for you. So if we jump into the masking tool, holding shift and hitting W, there's a select subject. What does that mean? Well, if I click it, it's going to automatically select the subject. Now, we're missing him over here, right? So in a case like this, we would have to add, we could add into our mask here, right? So if we want to intersect and we want to use the brush, it's going to let me, let's see here, invert. Nope, that's not the way to do it. Wait, hold on a second here. So I don't want to intersect that. I just want to add with the brush. So I could just create a new, let's see here. If we wanted to add to this manually, I think all we got to do is do the brush. And we want to it should, let's see, it's not giving us that option where it's letting me just add a brush in here. That's really odd. So if I'm going on to this and I'm adding, here we go. That's where I was doing it wrong. So I have to click on that and I have to hit add, and I want to add a brush, right? So, and I'm going in here and I'm wanting to add him. Now, if I wanted to do auto mask, which will help with the edges, I can. So if I'm going in here and I'm clicking just to make sure we're only selecting him, you might have that situation with a group shot, but you saw it grabbed all of them pretty nicely. So I will show you real quick why we want to
kind of create a quick mask of them. And now we can start to, right? We can add some exposure. So it's only adding exposure to them. Okay, that's fine. Maybe we want to just recover the highlights only on them. Okay, that's cool. Now, if we wanted to duplicate this mask, we can. Why would I want to duplicate it? Because I might want to also invert it. So if I go to this mask copy here, click on that. I can drag down. Where is it going to give me my invert option, which is typically, there we go. I had to click on it a couple times. Now I want to invert my mask. And it seems like it's only going to invert. Let's see, let's click there. Copy, click. It's kind of being funny here. So once I click on the mask, I would want to intersect. I just want to invert this mask. Why is it being such a pain here? Let's see. Maybe I need to close masking and reopen it. Click on that. Drop that down. I should have an invert option at the very top here, and I don't know why I don't. Cancel. Maybe it's only going to let me invert each of my masks. That's kind of annoying. So it's only going to let me invert the subject and the brush. Let's see, invert. Where is my subject select? Yeah, it's kind of being a pain. This might not be the best image to do it with, but if we, let's get rid of this. So since this has kind of a dual mask in it, it's not going to work as effectively here. But if we show that if we're selecting a subject, right, so it's not going to let us do invert for both. So it'll invert that one. But then when I go to my brush stroke here, yeah, it's just not going to do it very, very effectively. But you can see as you invert, it'll flip, right? So the red is showing where the effect's going to go. So if I wanted the background to be darker, I could brighten that up. So, right, in the same effects, it's important to kind of show that just the background's getting that right. So fortunately the kid on the left is being left out of the group. We could always go in and mask out, remove that. Brush later. Right, so I could come in and remove him after the fact, so he doesn't get all burn out. But you can see pretty quickly on that how we can use the AI masking. Now on an image where it's just, you know, smaller group, just the individual, like if we wanted to, for instance, in this image, do a quick subject select, we could then brighten them up, right? Duplicate, invert, darken the background. This is where you can really kind of see some, put into some dehaze here too. We can just kind of darken that just to show you real quick, like before and after. I mean, it's pretty powerful of a tool that we could, maybe we don't need to go too much on the exposure and we want to bring highlights down and kind of fix some of that stuff and, you know, recover a little bit of shadows on her. But I mean, you're talking like a night and day difference between these two images, right? Just using that feature. So it kind of helps a little bit more with smaller groups, not when they're broken up, but you kind of get the idea. So moving on to another quick tip that you'd want to have as well would be in the tools panel. You can, with creating a mask, you can make any of these that you want. You can make them shortcuts. So subject select by default doesn't have a shortcut. It requires you to go Shift W, create a new mask and click select subject, which I think is kind of clunky. So if I wanted to go into system preferences, I could go to keyboard, shortcuts, app shortcuts. Now Lightroom, Adobe Lightroom might not pop up there for you. So all you'd have to do is add it as a program. And once you do that, you can create subject select and build standard previews. The important part of this, when you create a shortcut, the menu title has to exactly match whatever the menu title is. So if it's called select subject, not subject select, that matters. You have to type it in just as it is here. Same way we built one for building standard previews. So build standard / sized previews written out exactly like that is important to have that work as well. So we can just do our hotkeys and it builds standard previews quickly. Those shortcuts go a long way, but definitely a useful feature for advanced editing, especially for the masking. All right, so step number 5 is going to be exporting images. So like we talked about, we imported our images, we organized them, we culled them, we edited them. Now we have to export them out of Lightroom. So to do that, we're going to make sure we're filtered to our 5-star images, which are the ones that are edited. We're going to select all, and we are going to go to File, Export. Now, this is showing that some of our originals are missing, so this is a good point, right? Now that we're done editing on our raw files, done editing from the smart previews, we want to reconnect our raw files. This is an important part, right? So it's a normal thing, and the nice thing is that little prompt pops up so you don't export smart previews, which would really suck, right? Because if you want to export full-size files, send them off to your lab, you're not going to find out, hopefully, until you upload them to the lab, that they're low resolution. So let's make sure we get our raw files connected, and you'll see here all these question marks, and this is perfect. These will all go away, and all of these folders will be illuminated because now the raw files will be attached. So now that that's happened, we can export our files and we no longer get that error. Now, exporting files is pretty straightforward, right? Where do we want them to go? Export location. Do we want to rename our files, right? We can rename them at export, or we can rename them right inside Lightroom. So real quick, before we export, like I talked about earlier, I like to rename my files and move them into a new folder. So I'm going to select all my files. I'm going to go over to the right-hand side, and I am going to edit the file name. So you might have a preset put together, or you can make a preset for how you want to name your files. But let's do this from scratch. So for this job, as you can already see, they say praying newborn on there. If I were going to, let's see here, I think these files, I can revert them back to the original name. Original file name, done. Click OK. So here's what the files looked like originally. And you can swap them back and forth as long as you're working, by the way, in the same catalog. That's something to keep in mind. So if you rename files wrong, you can always rename them later. But you have to do it in the same catalog. So if we go into here and select all, edit, and we want to name these customer underscore the event type underscore 2022, and we'll do dash, and we'll just have it count, 1 to whatever. Okay, go ahead and hit done. Now it's going to rename all my files so they look a little more professional. I think that that's important, and I also think it's important to do it in Lightroom because it's actually going to rename these files inside the external hard drive. That's really important, right? You want those files to be the same across the board, not just in Lightroom, not just when you export, but you want them on your hard drive. It's really important. You will need to back those up later. So if you have a backup drive, you want to make sure your new renamed files are backed up as well, so you don't have two versions flying around. Back to exporting. So we can export location, pretty straightforward. File naming, we don't need to do it. We already renamed those files. Then we can choose file settings, JPEGs. So a lot of your labs and web galleries and things like that want JPEG, and they'll want sRGB. So these are pretty standard. And then you also might want to limit the long edge to 2000 pixels. Say for instance, if you're uploading high resolution, not full. If you uncheck this full res files export, right, you can also limit the resolution. All those things are important. Now, the one cool feature about Lightroom and exporting is you can have actions in Photoshop automatically apply if you create a droplet. So if you're not familiar with creating a droplet, you can certainly refer back to a previous article that I have. But if you create quickly in Photoshop what's called a droplet, what that means is it saves a file to apply an action. So maybe you use skin smoothing and portraiture, maybe you use portraiture plugin, doesn't matter. But if you have an action that you want to apply to these images after the export, it can run as one full workflow. It's pretty cool, right? So if you create that droplet, or if you have different ones that you want to use, when you create those droplets, all you have to do is source that droplet in this export, and then you can also, right, save that as a preset for next time. So if I want to call this, skin smoothing, right, for print, I can click on that and it automatically remembers all of those settings for next time. So that's pretty cool, right? So exporting images out of Lightroom, very important. There's a fast way to do it, efficient way. I definitely recommend doing presets. Droplets are pretty cool, but rename first, I highly recommend. So let's jump into the results. All right, so there you have it. These are the results. Lightroom Classic is the go-to program for raw processing, right? It's just built to be faster. But with any program you're going to use, or any tool as a photographer, as a creative, you have to understand, of course, how to use the thing, but you need to understand those limitations and how to set everything up right. So we didn't go into like preferences and heavy-handedness of all the intricacies of importing and previews and all those processes, but what is important is to understand learning this program isn't as daunting as it can seem. I'm hoping these 5 steps really get you there, right? So from importing to organizing to culling to editing to export, I mean, what are you waiting for? This is the busiest wedding year, most weddings shot in decades, right? So save yourself some stress this year and definitely learn Lightroom today. Thanks for tuning in, guys.